Open. Open a door, and it opens all the others. Open a mind, and see what happens next. No great thing, no beautiful invention was created in a vacuum. It happens when we leave our comfort zone and come together. Embrace faiths, cultures, disabilities, differences. Embrace races, ages, ideologies, personalities, creating a tool or device nobody saw coming. Humanity is plural, not singular.
Hello, welcome. My name is Kelsey, and I'm super excited to be kicking off this Mosaic series with you. And this series really is all about us having conversations about our uniquenesses and our differences and about how to actually talk through and process some of that. And I'm nervous. Today we're going to talk about racism and race and different social groupings. And I am a little uncomfortable because I'm white, very white. Like I have board game nights, which turns out is a white person thing. And so I'm here to share a little bit from my perspective, and I know that it can be complicated and messy. And so if you're sitting in this room and anything I've already said has made defenses go up and you're a little antsy about what's going to be said, I'm with you. We're nervous together. But it's important that we can have these conversations. And so we're going to do two things. The first one, take a deep breath. And the second one is we're going to go to God first. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for being an incredible God, a big God, a God who created every language, a God who created different cultures and people groups, a God who isn't afraid of our differences, but is seen in our differences. Thank you for understanding when we're inadequate at dealing with these differences. Thank you for your grace as we walk through these conversations. Would you right now soften us, allow us to remove our defenses, and just be prepared to have a conversation. God, thank you for being a God who saves every person with every story. We love you. In your name we pray. Amen. So we're going to talk about differences over the next couple weeks, and I wanted to make sure that all of us kind of have some of the same vocabulary under our belts, because if I start saying something and you're assuming one definition and I'm assuming another, we're already going to be on the wrong page. And throughout this series, we're going to talk about some major differences that require us to at least start with a baseline. And I'm borrowing a lot of these terms from a book called White Fragility, which was an interesting read over the last few weeks as I've been preparing, but it's written by someone named Robin DiAngelo. And Robin is a sociologist who goes into different workplaces and helps people have these conversations. And she too is white like me and is willing to say, listen, it's an open conversation. It's a dialogue where we aren't trying to blame anyone. We're not trying to point fingers. The goal is never to have guilt or shame be put on anyone. Instead, we're going to openly and honestly begin to have conversations. And so her definitions take away some of that for us. And so we are going to start with prejudice. And prejudice is a prejudgment about another person based on the social groups to which they belong. And this makes logical sense in our brains. We think about a specific person, and our brains automatically put them into a group of people. And we have understandings about groups of people based on our own kind of self-preservation or based on the fact that the world is telling us to believe something. In fact, most of our prejudice is actually handed to us by media, by social media, even by our education systems. Like if you learn about the American Revolution and then you go to the UK and learn about the American Revolution, you begin to see we have different understandings because prejudice says we're only getting pieces of the story. We're only getting parts. And then we're judging an entire person based on partial information. The example that I can give that feels pretty safe is there's one that says women are bad drivers. And if you've never heard that one, that's good. It goes around often. There are memes dedicated to this prejudice, this idea that all women must be bad drivers. In fact, you get behind a car that isn't driving to your liking and your thought is, ugh, must be a woman. And we begin to have these little quips. I think a lot of our prejudice comes out in these one-liners that are supposed to be funny, but really kind of go back to that prejudice. And then when we're faced with our prejudice, we realize not all women can be bad drivers. I'm a mediocre driver, which means prejudice comes from somewhere, and when we recognize it, we have a chance to actually learn and build relationships with people. And so prejudice, all of us have it, and it's kind of a given. Every single one of us, no matter what culture, what country, we have an understanding about specific groups of people, and it's misinformed. Then the next word gets a little bit more dicey: discrimination. Discrimination is the action based on that prejudice. So that thing you understand about a people group, you now act upon it. And a lot of us, this is when our defenses begin to rise, because we go, okay, but I'm not discriminatory. I am not someone who's out there trying to be violent. I'm not doing these awful things to people groups, right? We go to moments in history where we took entire groups of humans and we put them in these camps and left them there. We go to moments in history that are filled with a lot of horrible things. So we say, I can't be discriminatory. But then as we slow down, we begin to realize discrimination lives on a spectrum. And on the other end is ignoring or excluding certain people from our lives, from what we are engaging in. And I can tell you, I've done it, because I look at a people group and I go, I've heard this thing about you, and I don't know if it's true or not, so I'm just going to separate and ignore, and I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm not going to say anything. We can both just continue to live on our own paths, and that seems fine. But it's discrimination because it keeps us from being in relationships with people. The next one is where this gets really difficult. The isms: sexism, racism, ageism. And it's a system benefiting the social group in power. What I want you to notice is it doesn't say it's an act of violence towards people that we think we're better than, or a thought that we belong to something and other people don't get those permissions, we're more important. It's not that. It's a system benefiting the group in power. In fact, to help us kind of process through this and unpack some of it, I want you to imagine a fence, a long wooden fence. And now imagine on the other side of the fence is something you want to engage in. I like to go back to my childhood when my dad would take me to the local community college and we'd watch the 49ers play before season began. And I'd get on his shoulders and I'd look over and Steve Young would be there, and it was awesome. You can imagine whatever sounds more fun than that, okay? A baseball game, a concert, a picnic, whatever you want. But imagine this fence, and the first person that walks up to the fence can see over, just naturally can see over. They're tall enough. They were just born that way. They were able to look over the fence and engage in what's happening and yell, hey, Steve Young, come sign my hat, right? They were able to be participants just because they were tall enough. They didn't do anything for it. My brothers are 6'5". It's not like they woke up and they were like, I'm going to grow to be 6'5". They just did. They could see over the fence. And then there's the person next to them, and the person next to them is not tall enough, but they have a box. And we don't know if the box was given to them, if they made the box, or if it just happened to be there. But they have a box, and so they step on this box, and they are now tall enough to look over, and they can, too, engage in what's happening on the other side of the fence. They are now participants in what's happening around them. And then there's the third person, and the third person isn't tall enough. And they're kind of trying to peek, look through little holes in the fence, trying to engage but can't participate. And they don't have access to a box for whatever reason. And so they're unable to be engaged. This is the ism. Is the idea that just naturally some people have extra that they can do because of the way they were born. They're tall enough. Whereas other people have to gain something in order to be a participant. They need a box in order to participate. And again, once we begin to recognize our prejudice, once we begin to recognize our discrimination, once we begin to recognize our isms, we can change it. But our natural instinct is, well, I'm going to get this person over here a box because I see that they need a box. And so I'm just going to get them a box. But now we're in the business of saying, well, I got you a box, And the next person is coming and I'm going to get you a box, and then the next person is coming and I'm going to get you a box, and pretty soon 2 things are happening. 1, we're now in the business of boxes instead of in the business of engaging. And 2, there's still an extra step for people in order to participate. So what if, in recognizing our isms, we tore down the wooden fence and put up a chain link fence? What if everyone had the same abilities to engage because there wasn't something hindering that relationship? And that's what we're going to head into, is to begin to have conversations about real change and real growth together. But it starts with us kind of processing through. And so I'm going to start. I'm a racist whose prejudice has led to discrimination. But I've been too concerned about proving I'm not racist that I can't make a difference. Today, I'm going to take those down, and I'm going to begin to actually process change. And it starts by being willing to squirm for the sake of stories, to be uncomfortable for the sake of the stories of the people next to us, to be uncomfortable enough to say, you matter. And I want to hear you, but I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. I'm going to sometimes mess up and squirm and walk through some difficulties together for the sake of stories, but not just other people's stories, but for our own stories and for the story that God is putting together all around us all the time. We squirm for the sake of stories because people matter to God. And this starts by acknowledging your story. Acknowledging your story, right where you are, right here, right now, acknowledging where you're at, owning your own position, and beginning to do the work to process through the isms and the discrimination and the prejudice. In order to get us there, we're going to go through the book of Ruth over the next few weeks. And the book of Ruth, really, if you kind of blink as you're going through the Old Testament, you'll kind of miss it. And it's just this little itty-bitty story tucked in about this mother and her daughter-in-law, which to me sounds like an early 2000s rom-com waiting to happen, but it's actually a beautiful story. And the whole reason the story is included in Scripture, the whole reason it was written down, is because Ruth is a Moabite woman. She is not from God's people group, and she is in the lineage of King David. And so years after Ruth, we have people in King David's era going, King David is the most important king of all times. Like, he's huge, he's the real deal, but he has this Moabite woman included in his lineage, and that doesn't fit with our understanding of the world, because even back in biblical times, we were still facing this issue of how do we put 2 people together that aren't the same? They were having the same conversations then that we get to have right now. How do we get 2 people with 2 different lives in the same space? So we're going to start with Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, as Naomi, the mother, gets to acknowledge her own story. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn to the country of Moab, and he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there." So the story starts with this family, Elimelech and his wife, Naomi, and they're from Bethlehem, where God's people are, but there's a famine in the land. For some reason, things aren't going well, but they hear Moab is doing pretty well, and so they begin to travel over to Moab and establish a new life. And so we already are beginning to see these 2 people groups come to surface, and to be honest, we don't know a whole ton about the issues between the 2 people groups right now. We know throughout the Bible there were assassination attempts, there were wars being had. The tension between the 2 groups has always kind of existed. So when they go and start over in this new land in Moab, Elimelech dies, and he leaves his wife and his 2 sons, and so they continue to try and make a life, and these 2 sons end up marrying Moabite women. And then, over the next decade, both sons die. And we're left with a story of these three women, and in this time period, women actually couldn't do a whole lot to make money for themselves. They relied on their husband's family to take care of them. And so Naomi's beginning to go, I can't survive here. I need to go back to the land of my husband so I can be taken care of. And she's beginning to acknowledge her own story as she looks at these two women and she goes, I'm going back to my people, but I had these two Moabite women with me. And so she looks at them and she says, go home. Go get married in your own hometown. It's safe, and honestly, not a bad idea. They could start over. They could start fresh. And for her, it is so much easier if I go to my home and you go to your home and we stay separate. And it is easier. But the two women are convinced they're supposed to stay with their mother-in-law, so they're like, we're going with you. And so these two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, begin to travel with Naomi, and Naomi turns to them eventually and says, listen, go home. I can't have more kids. Like, you're just gonna end up dead like me, and I'm just filled with sorrow. Like, go home. And so Orpah does, and she goes back to Moab and continues her life, but Ruth clings to Naomi. She's stuck on her. She's in it for the long haul. And that is when Naomi has to realize, I'm an Israelite woman going to my hometown of Bethlehem with a Moabite woman, and I have to deal with that. I have to actually begin to process through what that means, acknowledging her own story. For me, one of the first moments I remember really kind of wrestling with my own story and realizing my own position was when I was in college. We had an assignment. I went to school in Southern California, and we needed to go to a church that didn't look like our church and experience a different cultural experience around church. So I thought it would be a genius idea to get a couple of my friends and go down to a church in Compton. If you don't know a whole lot about Compton, Compton has a reputation. And as we're getting ready to go to Compton, that reputation is going through my brain. I'm remembering headlines that say, Compton, most dangerous city in America. Compton, not safe for white girls. And I begin to, as we're going there, go, uh-oh, what did I get myself into? And I'm prepared for the worst because the prejudice, the information I received was that this was not a good idea for me. I was unsafe. And I began to discriminate and close myself off from anything that could have happened that day. I began to close myself off from people. As we stepped into the church, we stood out like sore thumbs, like we were the only white kids anywhere nearby. And here we are, and this church is overwhelmingly kind to us and generous, like bringing us cookie after cookie, because that's how they welcomed people in this church. And I just remember being so closed off, and I just thought if I could just get to my seat, get through the service, go home, do my assignment, I can be done with this. And I began to discriminate and just keep myself away from people. And I go, and I sit down in my chair, and I'm observing what's going on, and as I look, on the wall is a picture of Jesus that looks kind of like this. And I remember looking at this picture, and instantly what went through my brain was, that's not Jesus. Jesus is white. And I stopped myself because I began to realize the way I pictured Jesus was like this. White, blonde, blue-eyed surfer Jesus. And as I sat there, I began to wrestle with the fact that Jesus wasn't white. He's Middle Eastern. But I had put my faith, my religion, my Jesus in a little white box so that I could understand it, so that I could grab hold of it. And in that moment, my little white Jesus box was opened, and I had to realize I am not okay at this. I've got some prejudice to work through. I've got some discrimination to work through. I am misunderstanding entire people groups. I've got some work because that little white box isn't sufficient for who God is. And it was that day that I began to squirm for the sake of stories. And it was awful. I wrestled a lot. I continue to wrestle and put my foot in my mouth and acknowledge my own inefficiencies at understanding all social groups. And I wrestle with it. But the stories are worth it. Once we acknowledge our own positions, we can begin to accept others' stories. Once we accept ours and get out of the way, we can accept the stories of the people around us. For Naomi, at this point, the entire story was about her. Her husband died, her kids died, and she's going back to her hometown. But now that she's kind of aware of the fact that I'm getting into a situation that's not clean and neat, this is going to be messy, she begins to accept other stories, and we hear from Ruth. In verse 16, it says, "But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge.' And here's the key, 'Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God.'" You see, Naomi stepped out of the way. And when Naomi got out of her own way, she got to experience an incredible young woman in Ruth. This woman who could have easily gone to her home country and started over, and that would have been totally fine. Instead, she's willing to go to a place that's not her own home and start a whole new life and be the outsider. She's willing to learn about Naomi's God and be a part of that community. She's also willing to risk her life for the sake of a mother-in-law. Her loyalty is beautiful, all because Naomi got out of the way. Now Ruth comes forward and her story gets to unfold into something incredible. Because when we get out of the way, we get to experience the stories of people around us in a brand new way. For me, a couple months after we went to this church excursion to Compton, we were told that we were going to do a service project for our school. You could sign up to go to one of our partner churches all over Orange County and LA County and go do some service work around different churches. And not because they need a bunch of 19-year-olds to take care of their buildings, because we're not going to be very good at that. But instead it was, hey, we want to be a bigger community. We want people of this school and this church to all be one community, and we want to experience the glory of God that way. And so I looked through the list, and there it was, church in Compton. So I said, all right, I'm going to go this time, but I'm going to get out of my way. I'm going to put my prejudice down as much as I can, and I'm going to put those walls down that I've built up, and I'm going to experience the stories of people in Compton. I'm going to just become a part of what's happening. So we go, and they hand me a paintbrush because that's apparently what I look like I can do. So I'm painting this children's wall, and I'm doing a pretty fantastic job. And this woman from the church comes up and she begins to paint alongside of me. And the two of us, as we're painting, begin to share stories. And she tells me about how she met Jesus when she was young and was all in, and then experienced incredible amounts of trauma and loss over the course of her teen years. And then as she got older and became a parent, she was so lost and confused, and this church found her. This church opened the doors to her and said, come be a part of what's happening here. And so she joined. And she was willing to be at this service project because she wanted to be a part of everything God was doing. And I got to know her. And then she asked me questions, and I got to share about how much I was missing my little brothers and where I came from in Northern California. And we talked and we processed and we became friends. And not because we needed to, but because we got to. Because we were both out of our own ways and willing to hear each other's stories. I got to learn from an incredible woman that day, and she got to learn from me. And both of us were willing to squirm for the sake of stories. Even if we said things wrong or inappropriately, we were able to graciously say to one another, hey, just so you know, there's a better way to say that. And we were willing to make mistakes and squirm because both of our stories matter and because what God is doing matters. We start by acknowledging our own stories. Then we get to accept other people's stories into our world. And then we get to adore His story. We get to adore what God is up to. When we open ourselves up, we get to see a bigger picture of who God is. For Ruth and Naomi, as they enter into Bethlehem, we see that God's up to something bigger than they thought. They weren't just going home. Something was about to change. Verse 19, it says, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? You see, what started out as a story about Naomi allowed her to step out of her way and became a story about Ruth and Naomi. And as they enter into a new community together, as they become one people together, now an entire city gets to grow and expand because God is up to something bigger than we see. When we protect ourselves and hide and just put ourselves in our safe little communities with people that think, sound, and act like us, we miss out on what God is doing beyond our cute little white boxes. And for them, the two of them, as they explored into this new community, an entire people was confused and didn't quite know what was happening. On one hand, it's because she is no longer with her 3 male counterparts. On the other hand, it's a Moabite woman entering into God's community. And something gets to happen because they were willing to let it happen. In fact, Ruth ends up being part of the lineage of King David, and King David is part of the lineage of Jesus. This whole story about Ruth actually leads us to thousands of years later when Jesus is on the scene and Jesus is here to live an incredible life, die on the cross, and then make it so all people get to be a part of his community. We get the story of Jesus, but before you get through Jesus' story, you start with his lineage. And his lineage was known, and I know we don't know our lineages very well unless you're on Ancestry.com or 23andMe or something. We don't necessarily know where we came from. But back then, they would have known so-and-so, birthed of so-and-so, birthed of so-and-so. And they would have known the lineage because it was their way of proving that, yes, I'm an Israelite through and through. I'm part of God's people through and through. I'm worthy. And so Jesus, who came to be the King of all kings, the King of the Jews, begins to lay out this lineage. And Matthew says this, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, it says, "And Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse." Then you get King David, and then eventually you get Jesus. You see, Ruth is in the middle of that lineage, which is already weird because lineages were men. You would list off the men in your family system. So it's already weird that she's there, which means she's there on purpose. And part of the reason she's there is because she's a Moabite. Because in Jesus' lineage, as we're trying to prove that he is worthy to be the King of the Jews, you get this little thing in there that would have looked like a blemish of a Moabite woman, a woman who didn't belong in Jesus' lineage, and yet it begins to unfold this story that maybe Jesus, even from the time of Ruth, was doing something way bigger. Jesus wasn't coming just to die for the Jewish people. He was coming to die for everyone. He was coming to open the community to everyone. Ruth becomes a picture of what Jesus is eventually going to do, and we get to continue in that path. We get to continue to experience God's glory in our stories. But we have to be willing to let people in. I remember my first trip to the UK was in London, and I was sitting on the tube, and I love the tube now. I think the tube is great. I know there's mixed opinions about it. But my first few times, I was pretty nervous about being on the tube. Didn't quite understand, didn't have a cell phone to use, was a little anxious. And so I kind of rode. I would sit if I could, and I would just put my head down and kind of be still. And my best friend would also, we were just kind of antsy about it, getting our feelings for it. And I just felt like Jesus was telling me to look up. So as I looked up in this tube and I looked to the right, there was this couple who had clearly just gotten here, had their luggage, they were headed to wherever they were staying, and they were talking to one another, and not in English. I'd like to be able to say I could tell you what language it was, but I had no clue. But they were speaking to one another in some language and having some incredible story time. And then down at the other end, there were these two women who were wearing their hijabs, and they were talking to one another. And I didn't quite look the same as these two individuals. And then across from me in the tube was this woman who was filled with sorrow, and her head was down. And we two did not look the same or act the same. And as I sat on the tube, I began to recognize this is what the church gets to be. The church gets to be a people filled with every tribe, tongue, and nation. We get to be filled with people's stories who don't speak the same language as us, people's stories who don't look the same as us, and all of us together get to glorify God because God is able to bring this group of people together, and in all of their stories, He is moving. And I want this place to feel like I'm sitting on a tube, and we're experiencing stories that are different than our own. I want the community of God to be so open to one another that we get to experience each other's stories, even if we don't speak the same language or share the same customs or look the same. But it starts with us being willing to squirm. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable and say the wrong thing and apologize. We have to be willing to squirm and act and process through, I've got some stuff to do. I've got some prejudice that I need to work through. We need to squirm because other people's stories matter. Our stories matter. And ultimately what God is up to, His story matters. So it starts with us. What do we do first? Some of us in this room are at the point where we are just realizing, yeah, I've got to process through this. Yeah, I realize that I'm tall enough to see over the fence, but now that I see that there's a fence, I can do something about it. And begin to process our own prejudice, process our own discrimination, and begin to recognize our little white Jesus boxes that we've created for our faith. For some of us, that's our starting point, is processing, is going to God and going, I've got work to do, help. For others of us, we've been in that process. We've been working through some of those things, and it's time to open up to conversations with people, to open up to other people that may not look, sound, or act like us, and not because we want to walk around and go, look, I have a friend who doesn't look like me. I'm pretty awesome. But because that friend matters. Their story matters. And because they need your story too. And begin to open ourselves up to relationships that we may have been too afraid to engage in because we're afraid to put our foot in our mouth or say the wrong thing. We get a chance to start over. We get a chance to build relationships with people. Right now we're going to watch a video with Brandon Hall, who was a guest speaker here a couple weeks ago, and him and Phil are having a conversation, and they've built a relationship, and so they're going to process through a little bit in their own experience together. And I want us to learn from them on how they've built an incredible friendship. Before we get there, let's talk to God. God, thank you so much for being a big God, a God who's not afraid of our differences, a God who's not intimidated by our uniqueness, but a God who is made more visible because of them. God, help us put our trust in you as we develop these friendships. Help us have honest conversations. Help us grow. And help us be willing to open this church up to look vastly different than anything we even imagine. Thank you, God. In your name we pray. Amen.
Well, hey, we are here hanging out with Brandon Hall. Brandon was with us just a few weeks ago, teaching on a weekend, did an amazing job, and I wanted to take just a few minutes during this series, Mosaic, where we're talking about how we identify and really work to do a better job of including all kinds of different people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities. And so I wanted to just take a couple minutes and let you, Brandon, share a little bit of kind of your story as you think back to what it's meant for you to find faith and be connected in church. All of us have our own story in that. If you would, just kind of share with us what has your story been.
Sure. So I grew up in the Seattle area. I lived there my whole life. I grew up at church. My mom and dad both were really involved. Some about me, so my dad is African American, my mom is Caucasian, so we grew up in mixed race family, and obviously like that was just normal for me, didn't think anything differently. And the first church experience I had was in an all black church, and then for most of the time I spent in church was predominantly white churches. And so I've kind of been on both sides of the spectrum, so to speak, but I don't think it was until probably middle school that I sort of understood like the differences that I had to those around me and sort of understood like why race was important. But really it was a church that, I learned about Jesus, came to faith, felt called to ministry, was really involved, found community. So I had a really awesome experience in church. And obviously this conversation is a really important part of that. But I think, the first thing that I think is probably helpful is that like I've had a really positive experience in church and really like have been blessed by it. And I'm really like sitting in this chair today as a pastor because of the church communities that I've been a part of and because of pastors who have invested in me and because of the teaching that I've been under and just all of the things that God has done through the church. So like, it's just been such a big part of my life from birth.
What are ways that maybe we're unintentionally doing things that are hurting that heart that we could maybe work on, either from past experiences or observations or just thoughts that you have?
Most of my church experience, I've been the minority. I went to both Bible college for undergrad, seminary for my master's degree, and I was a minority there as well. So I think in churches in general, and then in my experience in particular, like I was always different. And so I think something that I just learned over the years is that like my voice was always going to come from a different angle than the majority of the people in leadership, whether it be in a local church or like in seminary or Bible college. And I think for me, I think my experience is different because I come from a mixed race family. And so while I look like fully African-American, like I have this sort of picture into both worlds, so to speak. And so I understand it. I think being a minority is really difficult for a lot of different reasons, but I think in the church world, I think there's just not a lot of conversations like these happening where people are seeking to understand. I think some of these conversations get politicized and sort of get like seen as divisive, but like I think at the end of the day, like I'm a person with a story.
I wonder if there was somebody that was listening to this right now and they were thinking, okay, I want to grow in this, I want to engage in these conversations, but I don't have the kind of relationship maybe that like you and I have, and I want to gain that. How can they intentionally and in a way that's kind engage in this type of a relationship, or at least just start the dialogue?
Sure. I mean, I think I would lean into relationship first, dialogue second. And so I found the most meaningful relationships and the conversations that I've had have come out of mutuality. Like, I know that you care about me. I know that you know my story. I know that you have an idea of what makes me tick. And so then when we have these dialogues, like there's actually a relationship that can withhold them.
Like I hear that, and I think that's been our experience, that as we have had a stronger relationship and have had a chance to just be in life together, it's like that relationship, that support structure just can handle heavier and heavier conversations. But when we ask relationships that don't have that foundation to hold that weight, they collapse under it.
Totally. And specifically in the conversation of race, we don't see each other as like different entities, like, hey, here's some questions that you need to ask. Here's some things to avoid talking about. Here's some things that might sound really insensitive or offensive. Here's where this person might be coming from. And I think the more homework you do and the more questions you ask, I think the more intelligibly you're able to talk to them.
Dude, I really appreciate it, man. I know this is a hard conversation because we've all had conversations like this that go well, and we've all had conversations like this that go poorly. So I think, what does it look like for us to be open? What does it look like for us to engage in conversation and to truly build relationships with people, to hold the weight of these conversations? So thanks so much for being willing to have the conversation, buddy.
Over the next few weeks, we're going to hear from several people who are going to share different perspectives and open us up to beginning to build relationships that are meaningful and matter, because every story matters. This week, begin to do some self-reflection, begin to do some work inside to process through, have conversations at the dinner table, and begin to open up the door to having bigger and more meaningful conversations as the weeks progress. Join us next week as we continue to look at our unique differences that make us uniquely beautiful. We'll see you guys next week.